are going to be getting our hands dirty, literally. Hey guys, welcome back, or if you're new here, I'm Jan. Today I have 3 DIY projects using air dry clay that were all inspired by home decor trends that I've been seeing recently. No oven, no kiln, and totally doable at home. Let's jump right in. All of today's projects will be made using this big tub of air dry clay, which I will link below. For this first project, we are going to be making clay beads. I've been seeing these decorative beads styled everywhere lately, and I love how versatile they are. So I'm starting off by making these balls about 1.5 inches in diameter, and I'm just rolling them between my hands or whatever surface I can find to speed things up. We're also not aiming for perfectly round shapes here, so do not stress. I'm just going for that natural ocean toss pebble look, so I actually prefer the imperfections. If you do end up with some cracks, just take some water and smooth everything out. Okay, so I made 12 of these here, but note that I did end up adding a 13th because I reused some extra clay from the next project coming up. Before I stopped at 12, I wanted to make sure it would be long enough for the look I wanted, so I kind of just eyeballed it and arranged it into a pattern that simulated how it would drape over books and other decor pieces. To make the holes, I'm just using my paintbrush, but you could really use anything, like a pen or even your pinky finger. Since we're working with the thicker jute rope, just make sure the holes are big enough to fit it through.
All I can do is just tell you in this simple way.
Okay, now that I've set them out for a few days, here they are. I'm just going to give them a quick sand to smooth out the rough spots, mainly where the clay clumped around the holes. Also, I probably could have avoided this step if I used the water method while the clay was still soft, but we needed our counter back to cook dinner. To get a bit of color variation, I went with a dark brown, black, and a beige. So I coated one side, and then once it was dry, I flipped it over and then did the other side. And again, don't worry about having them perfect here since we are going to be adding more paint in the next step. Okay, so for our stone look here, I wanted to play around with some different light shades. I have this like gray, a white, and an ivory, and I did pair these with different bead groups, but honestly, looking back, you could probably just use one and have an almost identical look. I ended up ripping off a piece of this larger sea sponge thing since it was all I had, but I will link a similar version that's easier to work with down below. I'm starting with the black beads, and I kind of just dipped the sponge in the gray paint and then dipped it in the water once and started applying. The water helps to create a soft wash look, and it also makes it easier to wipe off any of the excess paint if you apply too much. You'll see I'm also using the dry end of the sponge to gently blend everything out until I'm totally happy with the stone look. For the brown ones, I'm using the same technique, but this time I'm using the lighter beige. And guys, I really did think these different light shades would create more variation, but as I mentioned, in the end, all the beads ended up with a pretty similar wash. What really made the tone difference was the base color of the beads. Okay guys, I used the white for these last ones, but once everything was laid out, I got a bit of cold feet. I just wasn't loving the sharp contrast between the light and dark beads. So I ended up redoing all the beige beads to match the look of the black ones, and I was way happier with this. Everything just blends together in a more natural stone-like way, if that makes sense. Alright, and to seal these, I'm going in with my mattiest of matte sprays. As I've mentioned in my other video, I personally have yet to find another matte spray that doesn't add a sheen, and I really want to keep this natural stone look. Now I'm using this thicker jute rope and again eyeballing it here and cutting double the length of the bead so I'd have enough room for the knots that you'll see in a sec. At this stage I wasn't sure how I wanted the ends to look or if I was going to add tassels, so I just did one knot at the end and strung the beads on with loose big knots in between. I also made a little shoelace tip out of the tape to make the stringing easier. Once all the beads were strung, I really liked the earthy look that was happening, so I didn't actually add the frilly tassels in the end. I wanted the beads to feel like something you could stumble across on a beach. To still add something cute, I tied a second loose knot, and I'm not sure if you can see, but I just unraveled the end to make a similar smaller scale tassel. I then trimmed the ends to make them purposely uneven and weathered looking and repeated the same process on the other side. I styled these in our bay window behind the couch with real driftwood and a few pieces that I felt gave off a nautical vibe. For this next project, I was inspired by Pottery Barn's nautical theme decor. They have so many beautiful coastal pieces and I wanted to recreate something with that same scalloped shell look. If you didn't know, I'm originally from the Maritimes in Nova Scotia, so I'm especially excited that the coastal theme is trending right now. So we are starting off by rolling this clay just like cookie dough. We are ultimately going to be creating a nautical shell looking bowl. I also found it helped to rotate the clay as I was rolling to help me get more of that even thickness and circle shape. You will want your circle to be a bit larger in diameter than what you want your bowl to be because we're going to be taking off a lot of the rim as you'll see in a bit. Also guys, don't skip the flour like I did because my clay stuck to the board and totally messed up the texture. I had to roll it out again, but thankfully the flour did the trick. I also should have just skipped the cutting board and rolled it right out on the counter. It might be hard to see, but I'm trimming off the outer edges where there's cracks and rough spots. And you'll want to do this because these areas are more likely to break when we start shaping the bowl next.
It wasn't supposed to go.
Not gonna lie, this part is definitely the most nerve-wracking. We are going to carefully place the clay circle over a bowl or jar that's roughly the same size. Just make sure it's tall enough because the clay is going to drape over the bottom. Also keep in mind that the size of the base you're using will determine how wide your finished bowl turns out. Now I'm just kind of going off of how the clay naturally draped and using the sticking out areas to form the waves. I'm also gently pulling out a few sections with my fingers and pressing in on the inner parts to shape it a bit more. I had a couple of small cracks along the way, but I didn't worry too much about it at first. I just kept pressing the clay back together as I shaped it. Once I was happy with the overall look of the bowl, that's when I went in with a bit of water on my fingers and smoothed everything out. This clay does shrink a bit as it dries, so don't be surprised if a few extra cracks show up. Just add a bit of water and press in some extra clay to fill everything in. These small fixes usually dry in just a few hours. Now that the cracks are fixed, I'm just giving the edges and any rough spots a quick sand to smooth everything out. Again, this doesn't need to be perfect, we're just trying to blend things out a bit and make it easier for the paint to go on nicely.
Over the border, they can't get us there.
Lastly, I'm just going in with my white craft paint and giving this 2 full coats.
And yesterday,
I'm so happy with how this turned out. I styled it in my entryway with some other coastal decor pieces and loving the final look. For this last project, we are doing beaded napkin holders. I was actually inspired by seeing these cute ones recently at the local boutique called Tin Barn Market, and I wanted to recreate the concept and add my own spin. So I'm rolling 9 little balls about the size of like a small olive, and I'm just using these little appetizer skewers we had to poke holes in them. I did this process 4 times to give me 4 napkin rings in total. I also did make the hole a bit bigger just to be safe because it makes threading the string way easier later on. I also went back in after a few hours and moved the skewer around to make sure the holes wouldn't shrink too much as they dried.
wishing star.
After a couple days of drying, I'm giving them a coat of this chalky gray, which I will also include in the links below. This part was a little tricky because the beads were small and didn't balance that well when I flipped them, so I ended up setting aside the fully covered ones and focused on touching up the ones that still needed paint. To add my own spin, I wanted to try using cinnamon. I mentioned this in my other video, but I'm kind of obsessed. I just love how it adds a rustic look to almost anything. Now you could skip this step depending on the look you're going for, but I wanted a softer tint on the bead, so I just grabbed a dry paintbrush and lightly brushed off the excess. I also learned pretty quickly that the fastest way was to just toss them all in the bowl and nuke them all at once. It saved me so much time. I used my matte spray as a sealer, but since the beads were so small, the spray was a little bit intense and it kind of drenched them and took off a lot of the cinnamon, making them look darker again. I repeated this process a couple more times until I got the look I wanted, and since these will be going on napkins, I also wanted to make sure nothing would rub off on the fabric. Lastly, I'm using this black elastic string. You can find it at most craft stores or on Amazon. I was originally going to use twine, but it doesn't stretch and I wanted something more flexible to fit the different napkin sizes. I'm just tying a knot on one end and then stringing on 9 beads and finishing it off with a double knot to keep it secured. I did this 3 more times and I hope you'll love the finished look as much as I do. That is it for today's creative mess. Like I said, these are super doable at home. If you had fun watching, drop me a comment below and don't drift too far. My thrift haul video is sailing your way soon.